So I'm going to get started now. My name is Rebecca Siggelkoe. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm from Bunker Hill Community College in Boston, Massachusetts. But you might be able to tell from my background and the fact that I'm outdoors and not wearing a jacket is that I'm not in Boston at the moment. I've been really lucky and I was able to come to Mexico. So I am here working and presenting at this conference. So please, if you're in a cold place, don't be too jealous and mad at me for that. But I'm super happy to be here to share with you some information about the things that we've been doing at Bunker Hill with our college partnerships and really trying to take an equity approach to the transfer partnerships that we have and the ones that we're going to be developing in the future. So just a little bit about me. I am a community college graduate. I had studied at Bunker Hill Community College some years ago and then transferred to UMass Boston, where I did a bachelor's and master's degree. So I had also studied at some other community colleges. So I've been through the transfer process. I've been working with students in an advising, transfer advising, and now in more of an administrative capacity for over 10 years. I'm a board member of the New England Transfer Association. I also am the academic officer for our statewide mass transfer program. And I love traveling, as you can see, dancing. I've been learning bachata and salsa dancing lately. I'm an outdoorsy person. I like warm weather. I'm a Spanish speaker. I used to live in Mexico in the past, and I also have a really cute little dog that I just look for an excuse to show her picture whenever I can because I'm obsessed with her. So today we're going to talk a little bit about national transfer data just to give us a little bit of context. I'm going to give you some really brief information about my institution and some of the data that we've pulled on our transfer students. We're going to talk about some transfer challenges, some of the steps that we use to develop an equity-informed strategic plan for improving our transfer partnerships. I'll share with you a little bit about our articulation agreements and how we share information with students. And then I'm hoping that we can have a discussion on future directions and share some ideas and brainstorming about ways that we can not only assess, but also develop articulation agreements that really work for our students. So this topic is really important because we know that transfer is not always serving the needs of all transfer populations. Mean data within our institution and national data, as you'll see in a few minutes, really shows that we have some very clear gaps in our outcomes for transfer in terms of racial and ethnic lines. So it is really important that we make sure that the programs that we have, whether it's for transfer or anything else, are serving all of our student populations. We need to look at transformation to promote equitable outcomes. We can't maintain the status quo because it's just not working for all student groups. Equity is central to our institutional and our statewide goals. So this has become a really important topic for us within our institution, but also the state of Massachusetts and the Department of Higher Education has made equity a main goal for going forward. And then college completion is, of course, a key factor in social and economic justice. So this has very widespread impacts across not only the education sector, but into our economy and beyond. So in this presentation, we'll discuss some institutional and national research. We'll discuss barriers to successful transfer. I'll help you understand the steps that our institution has taken to promote equity in our transfer partnerships, and we'll have a conversation to collaborate on future directions for transfer partnerships. I do want to add, if you have a question or if you have a comment that you want to add, I'm more than happy to have you just put it in the chat or just go ahead and speak up. Please feel free to interrupt me. I want this to be pretty casual, so I'm not just talking the entire time. So I'm going to go over this very briefly. I think a lot of people, especially if you're here attending this conference, you have some information about national data, but just to provide some context, community college is really important when it comes to looking at transfer and equity. And the reason is because about 41% of African American and Black students begin at a community college, and almost 50% of Latinx and Hispanic students will begin at a community college. So it's so important that we're making sure that community colleges are serving their purpose of helping students reach their goals for bachelor degree completion. And about 80% of community college students state that they intend to earn a bachelor's degree. So that's a really large number of students that are coming to community college with the stated intention of transferring and earning a four-year college degree. However, only about 25% of those students will actually transfer. And of that 25%, only 17% complete a bachelor's degree within 6 years. So as we can see, there's a huge disparity between a student's stated goals and what they're actually achieving. When we look at bachelor degree completion as broken down by race and ethnicity, we can see that the numbers are pretty low across the board, but we see the greatest disparity with Black, African American, and Latinx and Hispanic students. So just to kind of recap everything, national research on community college transfer indicates that there's vast disparities. And those disparities, some of you may have heard the term, the transfer equity gap. So I'll use that a few times throughout the presentation. And essentially, we're just referring to the disparities, the racial and ethnic disparities that we see between these groups. Black and Latinx or Hispanic students are less likely to transfer than Asian and white students. And when controlled for socioeconomic status, rates of college degree attainment for Black, African American, and Latinx students remain substantially lower. First generation students and other minoritized student groups also face systemic barriers to higher education, and colorblind educational practices and policies reinforce and perpetuate inequity in higher education. I think it's really important that we recognize and there you go. So I think it's really important that we remember that education was really designed for cis male people of privilege. This is not, the systems that we have in place were not designed to serve the students that are represented in our institutions. And that's especially true for students in community colleges and community colleges like mine, where we have a minoritized population is the greatest representation in terms of our demographics. So I think we have to also remember that it's not just that we have created these great new programs, keeping our students in mind, but most programs that we have were developed based off of traditional models of education that were designed for those students. So I'm going to just talk with you briefly about Bunker Hill. We are the largest community college in Massachusetts. We offer associate degrees and certificates. We also have a division of continuing education and workforce development. Our enrollment of last year was a little under 10,000 students with our average student age of 26. And we used to have a lot more international students. The last couple of years due to the pandemic has made it a little bit more challenging, but we have about 560 international students from 81 countries visiting us. And we are one of the most diverse colleges in Massachusetts and one of the most affordable diverse colleges in Massachusetts and the nation, and we are the most affordable in Massachusetts. About 68% of our students are also enrolled part-time. Over the last few years, we've developed a number of initiatives and received a number of grants to focus on equity at Bunker Hill. We just recently received a grant for being a Hispanic serving institution. And we also had received a pretty large grant for being an Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander serving institution. Both of those grants have helped us to transform a lot of our services in terms of our English language learning programs, and also developing transfer specifically for affinity groups and affinity-based support services. We also have the Center for Equity and Cultural Wealth at Bunker Hill. They were really important collaborators in looking at some of our transfer practices with an equity lens, and they have been able to provide us with a lot of data and also support to develop programs throughout the college to improve equity for our students and for our staff. They also have an initiative called the Halting Oppressive Pathways in Education Initiative. And this initiative is focused specifically on people who identify as Black males to help promote completion, graduation, and transfer. And then we also have some great support services like our Dish Food Pantry, which is on campus and even throughout the pandemic has continued to provide students with food and hygienic essentials. And we also have a single stop office that connects students with housing resources, food resources, and other social services. The Massachusetts Equity Initiative for the Department of Higher Education just released a publication called The New Undergraduate Experience, the Vision for Dismantling Barriers, Recognizing Students' Cultural Wealth, and Achieving Equity in Massachusetts in Higher Education. And this report essentially established that public higher education systems are not designed to reflect the needs of the student population, that educational achievements across the state of Massachusetts, while they are very high, are still determined by zip code and by race. And community colleges, the state universities, and the UMass campuses demonstrate consistently lower graduation rates among African American, Black, and Latinx students. So this is all contained in that report, and Massachusetts Department of Higher Education has been very clear that our state mandate is to improve success rates for all student groups, because we need to make sure that the education that students are receiving in Massachusetts is not predetermined by the area that they live in or their race. So here's some demographic data about Bunker Hill. As you can see, students of color make up about 70% of our student population, with the largest representative groups being Black, African American, and Hispanic or Latinx students. So we wanted to take a look when we were starting to think about transfer inequity. We knew that we needed to start to understand transfer at Bunker Hill. So we worked with our institutional effectiveness department and the Center for Cultural Wealth and Equity. Sorry, that's not working. And we started to realize that 70% of students at Bunker Hill do not earn a degree before transferring. And we realized that the majority of those students are earning between 31 and 45 credits. So they're getting very close, but they're not actually finishing their degrees. We also took a look at our top transfer destinations by race and ethnicity. As you can see, UMass Boston is our largest transfer destination for students of the largest demographic groups that we have at Bunker Hill. So that wasn't a surprise to us at all. One of the things that we did notice, however, was that when we look at UMass Amherst, which is our flagship campus for the University of Massachusetts system, we did see lower representation for Black and Hispanic students transferring to that school. We also wanted to take a look at associate degree attainment based on the transfer destinations. And as you can see for all of these, the majority of students are not earning a degree. And that's true for all of our top 5 destinations. This is really important for us to understand because we know that students who complete an associate's degree before transferring tend to be 49% more likely to complete a bachelor's degree within 4 years and 22% more likely to complete a bachelor's degree in 6 years. And this information was also echoed when we did some data sharing with the University of Massachusetts Boston, where we looked at completion rates for students who finished a degree versus those who did not. So we have a clear mandate at Bunker Hill to help students complete their degrees. We also did some 6-year cohort tracking to help us understand what students are doing at Bunker Hill. So looking at this chart, I'm not going to get too far into the data, but I wanted to share this because I think it is really important that as an institution, we're looking to see what students are doing and looking for vast discrepancies among student demographic groups. So you can see in the darkest blue at the bottom, those are the number of students that attained a certificate or degree. These numbers do seem high, but that's because this is a 6-year tracking. So this isn't 2 years, this is 6 years out. You can see in the lighter blue that those are the number of students that transferred. We have a small portion of students that are still enrolled. And I would note that for the Black and Hispanic students, you can see that we have not a huge number, but 10 and 11% respectively of students still enrolled at Bunker Hill after 6 years. The ones that are in orange stopped out after earning 30+ credits. So meaning they did not transfer, they just stopped coming to college after they've earned 30 or more credits. And then in red, students that stopped out, meaning they didn't transfer and they didn't re-enroll with less than 30 credits. So one of the things that we've started doing to help us understand equity is to do data sharing. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more and how we've implemented it in some of our new transfer partnerships. But UMass Boston is the first transfer partner for which we've started to really look at transfer data with an equity lens. And so we analyzed disaggregated student data from 2007 to 2019. Some of the questions that we asked were the number of semesters, the average number of semesters taken at Bunker Hill before students transferred, the average number of semesters completed at UMass Boston, the percentage of students completing a degree before transferring, enrollment patterns, full-time and part-time status, and then enrollment patterns by school or department, meaning which division of the university did students enroll into, and graduation rates. And some of the things from that data that we've realized is that Latinx and Hispanic transfers to UMass Boston have increased 108%. So we're seeing a lot more of those students transferring and going into UMass Boston. Latinx and Hispanic students are underrepresented in the College of Science, Math, Management, and Health. Those students are overrepresented in the College of Liberal Arts. About 65% of transfer students enroll as full-time. This was a really interesting data point because that's about the number of students that are part-time at Bunker Hill. So most students are changing their enrollment status when they leave community college and transfer into the four-year university. Transfer students who attend UMass Boston full-time are 37% more likely to complete a bachelor's degree, and students transferring with a degree are 32% more likely to complete a bachelor's degree. So again, it reinforces the drive to help students become full-time and also to help them complete their degrees prior to transferring. I want to take a quick moment to see if there's any questions. I see a question in the chat. Did you have any challenges getting buy-in from partner school regarding data sharing? So far, we haven't had any challenges. So when we develop articulation agreements, this is a requirement that we have, that schools have to agree to data sharing. We're not asking for specific student data, so we don't have to use any FERPA agreements or anything like that, where they're just giving us numbers, but we haven't had any issues. The partnership that we have with UMass Boston in the data sharing that they have provided us with was in part due to the Latino Success Institute, which was a grant-funded program looking specifically at the success of Latinx students at BHCC and UMass Boston. So some of that work was grant-funded. However, data sharing has become a standard part of our articulation agreements. And please feel free to jump in if there's any other questions. Thank you for your question as well. Oops. So I think we've all talked a little bit in the past about why students don't complete their degrees or have trouble with transferring. And of course, credit loss and the applicability of credits is always a major factor. I know that when I worked as an advisor at Bunker Hill Community College, one of the things that students would always ask is, you know, how do I know my credits are going to transfer? I don't want to take anything I don't need to take, and I don't want to waste any time. We know that there's challenges regarding cost. It's a big jump from going from a community college to a four-year university, whether it's a public or private school. The culture around transfer can be an issue. Students might feel at home at the Bunker Hill Community College or at their community college, but maybe they don't see themselves as represented at a four-year college. There's uneven distributions of work and outside responsibilities. So we've looked at studies that have identified that certain student demographic groups tend to work more hours than others. And so there's like clear demands on their time that take away from their ability to be full-time students, ineffective transfer pathways. So I want to open it up now for anyone if they want to share. You can share in the chat, but please also feel free to speak up and let me know some of the challenges that you've seen and experienced at your institution.
Hi, this is Holly. I'll talk. Can you all hear me? This is my first time using my mic today.
I can hear you.
Rock on. Hello. I'm at Columbia College Chicago. We are a arts and media focused private institution, four-year. And it's really your first bullet point, the credit loss, but the applicability of credit is more of the issues. And so many of our majors require placement, level placement into dance or music. Sometimes a student may have completed 4 semesters worth of dance and transfer to us and are on the second level by our placement procedures. And so sometimes students will leave because of that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a significant issue.
I think it's particularly challenging for students in the arts. That's like that can be one of the really challenging like majors to transfer, like dance. So we don't have a dance program at Bunker Hill, but I know like with our music students and our art students, it's particularly challenging. And they also have those like, portfolio requirements as well that often need to be met. So applicability credits is really important too, because I think students often see like, oh, this school will take up to 90 credits, so I can take as many classes as I want and then transfer them over, but they don't necessarily understand that those credits might transfer, but if they're not applying to your program, they're not helping you get towards that goal of bachelor degree completion. And transfer is challenging enough for students, but getting to that level of detail can be really hard to help them understand. So I'll give one more moment if anyone else wants to add something, and then I'll just move on. Thank you, Holly, for your contribution. Okay, I'm going to move forward then. I clicked too fast, sorry. There we go. So some of the things like I kind of already touched on before, but we have credit loss. A big challenge that we had at Bunker Hill was really ineffective and very outdated articulation agreements that were not helpful for students. Our statewide transfer agreements, while they work great, they can be very limiting for community college students because some of them have like a full-time requirement that not all students are able to utilize. We also don't have an agreement for every major. Most of our statewide transfer agreements are for our Associate of Art programs. They're not necessarily for our STEM programs, so that can be a challenge. We have application fees, tuition costs, a lack of interinstitutional collaboration and student support. So for example, when students are interested in going to a four-year college, they might ask, can you help me decide which courses I can take? And they're not always necessarily the four-year school is not always able to provide that level of detail and advising. So students get scared that their credits aren't going to transfer and they transfer before finishing. We also had a lack of college-wide knowledge about transfer opportunities. We didn't have any data sharing requirements with our institutional partners, and there was a lack of a supportive transfer culture. Over the last couple of years, we've really been able to build our transfer services team, but prior to that, our transfer services was too focused on doing transcript evaluations and helping students transfer in that it left very limited resources for advising students on transferring out. So we realized a couple of years ago that we really needed to transform the way that we thought about transfer partnerships. So I've kind of tried to look at all of the different steps that we did in creating this plan and then walk you through a little bit of the process. And at the end, I hope that we can talk a little bit more about some of the tactics that we've used and hear from you and your thoughts and what you think has been effective or what you think could be effective at your institution. So the first step of this process of transformation at Bunker Hill was to really understand our students, their transfer patterns, and the best practices in transfer. So as I shared with you a little bit of some of the data that we started to look at, we also did a review of our national data. We had some support from our Center of Equity and Cultural Wealth at Bunker Hill to provide us with some funding and some support to do some research on transfer equity at our institution. So that was really helpful and allowed us as a transfer services team to gather together after hours and talk about these issues and talk about some of our goals. And so that was a really important part of developing the new transfer programs that we have. And we also looked at things like the ACRO best practices for articulation agreements and any other resources we could find, like we've been attending conferences to try and become as much as we could as experts in transfer and articulation agreements. So the next step was collaboration and goal development. So we wanted to really bring transfer and equity into initiatives on campus. Equity has been, a huge buzzword. It's been something that we've been trying to apply in all of our teaching practices, but we really wanted to bring transfer into that conversation as well and recognize that equity and transfer are super important, and that if we're a community college with the majority of our students stating that they want to transfer, we can't ignore transfer and equity. We started to develop goals for transfer partnerships that were aligned with our institutional goals and the Massachusetts Department of Higher Education. We've been working with our transfer partner, UMass Boston, to get qualitative data from students to hear what they need in their transfer experience, what they're looking for in terms of pathways and how they can be supported. We needed to implement disaggregated data sharing.
Supposed to be raining and stuff at 4.
Implement disaggregated data sharing so we can assess the effectiveness of partnerships for specific demographic groups. And we need to use an equity lens in the development of sports services and integrate high impact practices into teaching and advising and make transfer central to those practices. The next step was to develop a new structure for partnership. So I think in the session for the first time to the conference session, we talked about advocacy and transfer partnerships, and we realized that student advocacy needs to be central to our transfer partnerships. As enrollments have dipped over the last several years, we've had a lot more four-year universities reaching out to us with an interest of developing an articulation agreement. In the past, we didn't have any structure or plan for transfer partnerships. So essentially, if any department chair or dean or administrator connected with another school and they said, hey, we want to make an articulation agreement, they would just go ahead and make one. There was no guidelines in terms of, well, how is this going to impact our students? How is this going to improve the transfer trajectory of our students? And what's in it for our students? So we knew that that needed to be central to our articulation agreements. So the days of just kind of saying yes to everybody and creating an articulation agreement have ended. And now we think a lot more strategically about with whom we're developing an agreement for which student population and making very clear goals about those transfer partnerships. We want to develop partnerships that reflect the priorities and the realities of our student population. We want to use data rather than assumptions. And we want to implement a process and structure for partnership management. So that includes having a coordinator responsible for overseeing our articulation agreements. I am that coordinator for now. And then also we use project management software. At our campus, we use a program called Basecamp, and that helps us not only store all of our documents, but also keep track of revisions that need to be done and manage our workflow for like making updates, creating transfer guides, passing along agreements that need signatures. And the best for me, my favorite part is the reminder. So I have a calendar letting me know when agreements need to be revised and updated. I also have a calendar that reminds me of when I need to connect with that partner school so we can have a meeting to make sure that we're on the same page and to make sure that we're working towards shared goals and shared messaging around advising students and using these articulation agreements. And then finally, we needed to inventory and improve our existing partnerships. So as I said before at Bunker Hill, we didn't have any systematic ways of creating articulation agreements. Any department chair or dean or administrator that wanted an articulation agreement could just go ahead and make one. That information would maybe be listed on our website. Maybe it would be shared outside of the institution, but that wasn't always necessarily the case. So we needed to go through and inventory all of our articulation agreements and update all of them if we determined that they were even helpful for our students. We also needed to make sure that we were communicating with our interinstitutional partners to make sure that we're helping students, advising students through degree completion and sharing communication, being connected. So when we had questions, if students came to our transfer advisors with questions, we had a person that we could give them a warm handoff to and really create a system of support for them. And we wanted to identify gaps in our pathways and partnerships. So we really wanted to first focus on the existing transfer patterns we were seeing. So we know that we don't want to spend our time creating an articulation agreement for a program for which we have 1 or 2 students in. We want to make sure that we're first looking at, okay, we have a large representation of students in this academic major, what are the pathways for those students and how can we strengthen those to make sure that they're having a positive transfer experience? And then step 5 is really the maintenance assessment and future planning for these partnerships. So as I had shared before, we're implementing demographic data sharing with partner colleges. So from now on, like when I updated all of our agreements and for new agreements that we create, data sharing is required. So the buy-in has been very positive because most four-year schools are interested in partnering with Bunker Hill. We're the largest community college in the state. We have excellent students. We're located in Boston, where we have a lot of four-year universities. So those four-year partners want to partner with us. And so asking them for the data sharing, in my experience, has not been an issue. We're asking this for every 3 years. So every 3 years, we do a full revision of our articulation agreements. And during that time is when we would expect the colleges to do data sharing with us. Again, we're not asking for specific student names or student data or any identifying information. So we're not having to use any FERPA agreements or FERPA releases. We're really working on developing alliances and joint admissions with our top transfer destinations. So right now we're working towards doing a joint admissions program with UMass Boston. So students would automatically be accepted into the major since that is our top transfer destination. But we're also starting to look into more selective admissions institutions since transfer students do have great success in selective admissions programs. So that's one of the goals moving forward, is that we will have more selective schools in our, we'll be partnering with more selective institutions and hopefully move more towards joint admissions programs. We want to also increase visibility and celebrate transfer culture. So we've been doing more things around transfer workshops, transfer advising. We have a lot of available one-on-one appointments with transfer advisors. We also celebrate Transfer Week. We participate in departmental specific events on campus to bring transfer into student programming. We also have a competitive college week where we invite competitive colleges from all around the country to come and meet with Bunker Hill students, at this point virtually, and really helps Bunker Hill students understand that they can have a place and be competitive applicants at these really selective institutions. We really want to use racial equity as an outcome measure for assessing partnerships. And this, I think, is just the kind of heart of this presentation, is that partnerships are only as effective if we know that they're reaching our student groups and the students that are represented in our campus. So racial equity as an outcome measure is incredibly important. We want to expand on our interinstitutional relationships and also explore non-vertical transfer patterns. Some of you may have heard of the term the transfer swirl. That is something we definitely see at Bunker Hill. We have students starting at 4 years, coming to Bunker Hill, going back to the 4-year, students transferring from a 2-year into a 2-year, into a 2-year, into a 4-year. So transfer is not always linear. So we need to recognize that and look at ways that we can support those students. And then also review our policies and transfer with an equity lens. We've realized more recently that some of our policies are not equitable. So for example, our grading system and our transfer policy for minimum grades is not consistent with that of our 4-year institutions. That's caused a barrier for our students, especially for those students that start at a 4-year college and then come back to Bunker Hill. So I've been pushing really hard, and some of our administrators are starting to recognize that we need to make sure that our transfer policies are promoting student success and not creating barriers for students. And so that's another future step that we're moving towards. So I'm just going to take a moment to look at some of the chat comments. Give me 1 second.
Is it okay if I ask a quick question?
Yeah, of course.
I'm hoping it's quick. It might not be. Thinking about Shelley Lemons, I'm a City Colleges of Chicago, and as you're talking about the partnerships that you are reevaluating, because we're going through the same process right now. Is there a moment, and how do you define that moment when you say this might not need to be a partnership that we continue with? And then how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, so we did recognize that there was a few partnerships that we did not want to keep. So one of the things that we've asked schools to do when we were assessing some of these partnerships is we asked, even though we didn't have a formal data agreement in place, a data sharing agreement in place, we asked if they could provide us information about students that have transferred. And so we asked, like, could you tell us how many students have enrolled, which programs have they enrolled in, and what were the graduation rates? And by doing that, we were able to use more data to inform our decisions. So one of the schools that we had a partnership with, we had some questions about. They were a for-profit institution. There had been some things in the news about their, questioning their accreditation status. So we had some concerns, and some of our deans had some concerns. And so that was one of the schools where we said, well, before we can decide that we're just going to automatically continue with this agreement because we had it, let's look at the data and see what's happening with our students there. And we realized that very few students were even using the pathway. So we didn't have a large representation of students transferring there. So it made it a little bit easier for us to say, thank you very much. We appreciate the partnership that we've had, but at this time, we don't think it's going to make sense for us to move forward. I think that as a community college, we need to not feel like we need to say yes to everyone. And this has been a conversation that we've had with our administrators, because in the past, it was always kind of like, oh, you want to work with us? We're just a community college. Thank you so much. We're so humble. And we're really trying to transform that. And I'm trying to transform that. And I don't always mind being kind of the bad guy and saying, like, we can't just say yes to everyone. And this has been a conversation we've also had with our internship programs. We had schools or institutions or organizations that wanted to hire our students, but we're now saying, like, what's in it for our students? Like, you have to show us why this is a great deal for our students, like that they're getting a bang for their buck, that their time is going to be well invested. And really, it's bringing that advocacy piece in to it. And so I shared with the documents a checklist of things that we look for in our transfer partnerships. And one of them is, like, we want you to waive that application fee. We want you to waive that essay and the letter of recommendation requirement. The only exception is for the music and like the art programs, because they do have like portfolio, or audition requirements. That's a little bit different, but overall we're saying, hey, if you want our students, you're going to have to give them a break, and make this as easy as possible. And that has meant saying no and ending partnership with some institutions, or having the opportunity to meet with an institution that's interested in an agreement, giving them the time to share their information, but then really having hard conversations and discussions about whether or not that's something we want to do. So learning how to say no, thank you very much, we appreciate it, but it's not necessarily a partnership we're wanting to continue or pursue at this time, has been a painful part. But having these very clear, direct goals has helped us to do that, because before we didn't have any strategic plan. It was just like, we have articulation agreements. But now it's like, we have very specific goals for our articulation agreements. And unless you can demonstrate that you're going to help us meet those goals with our students, then it's probably not a partnership that we're going to invest our time and energy in. Because it is a lot of time to create an articulation agreement and to review an articulation agreement. It's a lot. But thank you so much for bringing that up.
Yeah, I'm glad that you have administrative support. I'm still working on getting that.
So it's not always the easiest. Sometimes our other institutions are, they're going right to the top and saying, hey, we'd love to partner with you. And then the directive to work with that institution comes from the top down. But luckily we do have, like, when my dean and I are very much on the same page, and she's amazing. And so when we say, okay, we've looked at the data, we've looked at the information, we don't think that this is in our students' best interest at this time, we usually have that backup. So it is very important. But I think at least at the end of the day, having those stated goals for what you want your transfer partnerships to do can really help you, make sure that you're staying in line with that vision.
Thank you. I'm going to keep pushing.
I'm here, like kind of backing you up. So yeah, these were the steps that we use. I'm not going to go over this again, but this is just kind of a broad overview of how we started tackling this process. So as I mentioned, we didn't have any real systematic ways of approaching articulation agreements in the past. So we have these on our website. Before, we had AS accounting, like this was how our articulation agreements were listed on our website. We had the list of the major, the list of the name of the institution, and then a link to their website. Students literally had no information whatsoever about the articulation agreement, how to navigate it, what to do for help. So I'm just going to share with you very briefly what we've done in our revision. So we created a new website called Transfer Partnerships, a new page on our website called Transfer Partnerships. And we've very clearly delineated the difference between articulation agreements, guaranteed admissions programs. We have some transfer in programs, and then this is a link to our mass transfer statewide program. I'm going to focus on our transfer articulation agreements. So as you could see before, we just had the name of the school, the name of the BHCC major, and then a link to a website. But now we've created transfer guides and guides and also included contracts for each articulation agreement, and all of our advisors, admissions, faculty, administrators, everybody gets regular training and updates on how to work with students and using these articulation agreements or these advising guides. So for example, I'm just going to click on one here. And so each of these advising guides gives a brief snapshot of the eligibility, so what students need to know in order to participate in the program. It gives contact information for who they need to work with if they have a question or if they want help. And then it also gives them a breakdown of how their courses are going to transfer. The contracts themselves also include the list of courses that students will need to complete once they've transferred to finish their bachelor's degree. So these are one of the things that we've created to help share information, make these agreements much easier to understand and navigate. And students can also see exactly which degree they are looking at. Excuse me. Let me just take a look at the chat here. I think a couple of things came in.
We do have quite a few questions coming up in our chat box.
Yeah, could you let me know what some of those are, Caitlin? Because I think I'll lose track.
One question is, how do you, when you mentioned racial equity as an outcome measure for partnerships, how do you measure racial equity? And is it with surveys on the student experience, for example?
So we're going to be looking at completion rates, so bachelor degree attainment across the racial demographics, and also the time to complete a degree is really important. And then other things we'll look at is the programs that students are going into. So one of the things I mentioned was that we had overrepresentation of Latinx students in the College of Liberal Arts at UMass Boston, but underrepresentation in the College of Science, Engineering, and Mathematics, underrepresentation in the College of Management. And so we're also in the next level of data sharing, we're going to be asking for major specific information in that area so we can start to say, okay, students in this major, like white students in this major, are seeing lower success rates than Asian students or higher success rates than Black students, and really start to make comparisons, because then we can say, okay, students of this demographic in this major need more support. There's something that's not working for those students. So what is it? Is it a difference between like the full-time versus part-time status? Are they underrepresented? Do they need to hear from more people that maybe look like them or have been through the program to support them? Like, there's a whole lot of different ways that we can look at partnering with our existing initiatives on campus that are really affinity based to see how we can maybe support those students. But essentially, we want to see that those graduation rates are pretty consistent across the board, and that we also have representation in some of the higher income earning degree programs as well. I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, yeah. Okay, I also see another question. Okay, thank you. What type of calendar do you have that reminds you of agreements? So it's within Basecamp. The Basecamp program, again, it's a project management software. So you can set reminders and it basically has a system of alerts. So whenever I create a new articulation agreement or update an articulation agreement, I set a yearly reminder for us to have a meeting. And at that time, we come together with our admissions partners, the transfer admissions partners at the four-year college, our transfer advisors on campus, and the department chair for that specific program. And we meet at least once a year so we can talk about our agreement and talk about the ways that we can support students through degree completion at Bunker Hill and also in their transition to the four-year university. That software also reminds me when the articulation agreement itself needs to be updated, and that's when we have a more formal agreement to review, make sure that we've not had any significant changes to our enrollment. That's when we would start to ask for the data so we can make an assessment of that program and really get into a more like specific conversations about, well, students are finding, for example, maybe our students are transferring but having low success rates in a higher level class. And so then we can also say, well, maybe there's an issue like students aren't prepared for the prerequisite or something like that. So every 3 years is when we're doing a much more in-depth review of the articulation agreement. But yeah, it's all through Basecamp. Let's see. Okay, what engagement have faculty demonstrated in assisting with this? So faculty have been super on board with this process because before, as I said, we never had one person overseeing articulation agreements. So faculty would sometimes be encouraged by their deans to do it, but they didn't necessarily know how. We didn't have a standard template that we used. We didn't have standard like asks that we were looking for in articulation agreements. So that faculty love the fact that now they have myself or one person that's kind of managing the entire process. And so they are coming to our meetings to have those early conversations about curricular alignment, sharing what our students are looking for, sharing what our students are interested. And then they also come back to the table when once the articulation agreement is established and we're meeting with our partners to make sure that we're serving students in a really holistic way. It's really important for us that our department chairs are connected with the department chairs at the partner institution and other faculty at the partner institution so they can help support our students. And I know that our department chairs, some of them have been so amazing in making that warm connection for our students that are interested in specific transfer programs. So our faculty have been amazing. I'm super thankful for the collaboration that they've had because it really helps make that transfer experience a much more like collaborative one for the students. So they know that whether they're trying to connect with a transfer admissions professional or they're trying to connect with a faculty member, that they can use us as kind of the liaison to make that connection. And I think when they actually do transfer and get into that institution, they already have somebody that they may have met or worked with to give them a warm welcome. And Shelley, love to connect with you more too. Please be in touch with me. So I'm gonna get back to my presentation. You can see my presentation again, right? Fantastic. So we only have a couple minutes left, and I just wanted to I wanted to have more time for conversation, but please feel free to pipe in and let me know what you're thinking. I left this quote here. This was from our the New England Department of Higher Education about looking at transfer and education from an equity standpoint. So I'd love to just hear any last thoughts that anyone would like to bring. I want to also encourage everyone, if you want to see more like granular details about some of the checklists that we have for our transfer partnerships, that document is included along with the slides for this presentation on the website. So please take a look at that because that lists everything we're looking for in terms of like, we want you to waive the application fee. We want you to waive the essay requirement. We want you to waive, the letters of recommendation. We want you to
provide the same scholarships you do to first-year students.
Yeah, exactly. Like have transparency about cost and scholarships, et cetera. So all of that is listed on that document. So I'd encourage you to take a look at it. Hopefully that can help spark some ideas. And I think Shelley, you brought up such a good point that it's really about like advocating for our students. And that sometimes means like saying no. Like if we don't see that this is really a great deal for our students, then we can't support it wholeheartedly. Like that's what we're here to do. And that means really looking at our student population. And if we see an agreement that we say, you know what, this will maybe be effective for like 4% of our students who are like taking 5 classes a semester, have a super high GPA, like those students are important too. But we also need to focus on students who are working 2 jobs, have kids, have a family. Like they aren't necessarily going to be able to access this partnership. So we don't want to leave them out in the transfer partnership program that we have. So that being said, there's about a minute left if anyone wants to chime in, but I thank you so much for your time and joining me here today. And I'm super happy to share any information. I'm going to have some references here, but This is my little code for my LinkedIn. If you want to connect via LinkedIn, you can also feel free to send me an email. I will let you know that if I don't email you back, it's because our security for our emails is crazy and it often bounces external emails away, but you can also connect with me on LinkedIn if that happens. Thank you kindly.
It does look like we have a hand raised as everyone's exiting the room. There might be one question if he's willing to stick around.
Hey, Josh.
Yeah, hey, I had a quick question. So one great presentation and all the work that you're doing to make sure that transfer students are treated right and fairly. And I really like how you have the base level being like, basically white glove service for our transfer students, right? Because we have to do it for them. I want to ask about your relationships with the HBCUs. I know here in California, we have an HBC community college to HBCU transfer program and coordinator at the state level. I want to know like if you guys have that at your campus or like what kind of outreach you do to HBCUs for transfer students who want to consider that and as an opportunity for them.
That is a wonderful question. So we do not have a transfer partnership with any HBCUs at this time. Geographically, we don't have any in our area. So that's been one of the reasons for that. Like 90% of our students stay local. Very few are transferring out of state. And, even fewer than that are even going as far as like UMass Amherst. Like most of the students that live in Boston, they don't have cars, they stay local. That being said, we did just have a former faculty member go to an HBCU in Louisiana, and we've been in early conversations about doing like almost like a study abroad program. It would be a semester away at an HBCU. And so we're beginning conversations about that to see if it's feasible, how we can get some funding and scholarships. So we'd love to see if not so much necessarily a transfer partnership at this time, but maybe an opportunity for students to do a semester at an HBCU that would be out of state, but we need to make sure that we have funding for it because otherwise it's just not necessarily going to be an accessible option for our students. So we're in early conversations with that and we're super glad to have one of our faculty that's gone there. We also have an administrator that's a former Howard alumna. And so we've been talking with her about things that we might be able to do with Howard University as well. But that is something I would love to do, is really look more at like affinity-based partnership and, transfer, and then also like, semester away programs for those schools. Thanks for bringing that up, Josh.
Yeah, there's a link in the chat for you.
Oh, cool.
And I know
Thank you.
Dr. Aaron Azut Settle would be happy to chat with you about it.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you so much.